I was responding at the time. It was the summer of 2014, and those children, those Palestinian boys, had just been killed, murdered on the beach, um, and it has been a long process for me to unpack all the things that I was raised on. It didn't happen that day. That, I think, was the last straw. There were many prior straws, um, and um, and then people were. I was becoming newly aware of how little room was given to American Jews to make legitimate criticisms of what was being done in the name of Zionism or in the name of Israeli necessity. And I just started thinking of how much our community, our Jewish community in Montreal, had been leaned on and expected to do, and was frequently thanked for doing on behalf of Israel throughout my lifetime, 60s, 70s, 80s. And I became aware that it was a strange turnabout. What is it? Turnabout is fair play. You know, it became strange to prohibit criticism when all those years of adulation were warmly accepted, encouraged. And then I started to realize, because as you can see, my childhood is a bit dimly remembered by me, but I started to remember one teacher in particular who was an Israeli shaliach. And that's what made me remember that we had shlichim, which is to say people who were sent from Israel to live in Montreal for a year, to be teachers, even though they really, for the most part, were not very good teachers, because I don't think that they were trained as teachers. They were more like camp counselor type people. But this one guy who I remember him teaching dinim, and I'll tell you why I remember him teaching dinim, which is laws. And it's because one time he was telling the story, teaching us the story. I was in 7th grade probably, because I remember the classroom. And he was teaching us this story of how Moses, when he was receiving the tablets, was up on the mountain for 40 days. Am I remembering that right? And the story he said, or that the rabbi said, was that Moses had his arms up for 40 days. And so he was telling us that that was part of the miracle, to have your arms up for 40 days. And I guess I'm by nature a skeptic, and I was sitting in the back row, and I thought, how hard can that be? Like, holding your arms, like, why is that a miracle, holding your arms up? And so I just kind of put my arms up a little, because I didn't want to make a to-do about it, just to kind of check it out, you know? And he called me out. He saw me doing it, and he said, are you something like, you know, are you doubting that that's a miracle? And I was like, well, I was just checking to see. And he said, okay, well then come up here. This is why I remember this. And he called me up in the front of the classroom, and he put me in a corner in the front. And he said, stand there with your arms up. Let's see how long you last. And, you know, who knows how long I lasted, 2 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes. It wasn't 40 days. So that's why I remember it, and that's why I remember him. I remember his name, and I remember that he taught dinim, and I remember that incident in class. And I also remember that every year, and I remember in the same classroom doing it, so it was all the way up through middle school and maybe past then, but certainly when we were little, and then until we were 12 or 13 for sure, we would raise money to plant trees in Israel for Tu B'Shvat. And the way that we did it, which I now think was really brilliant, now that I understand more about the role of the censorial in political life, but so it was really brilliant, is we would raise all this money, and then depending on how much money you raised, you would get these black and white sheets of trees, and you would get one sheet if you raised $10, but if you raised for sponsors, you know, and if you raised 30, you get 3 sheets or whatever. And then with each sheet, you would get a sheet of stamps. The stamps were each one a picture of a leaf, and you would have to, you know, separate them like stamps and lick them and put them on the thing. And that was like a fun project that you would do during class time. I still remember that the paper was kind of cheap paper, like really, really thin. I remember the taste of the glue on the back. I remember, like the cheaper ones, like the corners curl up. Like I guess what I'm saying is I have hardly any childhood memories, and I remember the corners of the stamps curling up when I was putting the leaves on my trees, which I'm sure I loved doing.
Sensory memory.
Yeah. And I think all of that was about, really impressing into us in a corporeal way, in a sensorial way, a connection to Israel that was completely ambient as well. Like we lived in this world where it was, like gravity. It was just a fact of life that we had some sort of relationship to the place, and a positive one, and that our lives depended on it. I should say that as well. There was this sense. Many of us, there weren't many of us descended from Europeans. A lot of the people I knew were second or third generation Canadian, but I was first. And there was a sense of, you never know when you might need that place, so we support it now because we might need it at some point. That definitely, the sense of both belonging in Montreal and the fragility of a Jewish existence in diaspora were simultaneous. Like we were very much Montreal Jews, and at the same time, you never know what could happen at any moment. What happened was after I saw the events in Gaza that summer, and the militarized Israeli response, and knowing everything else that I already knew and was already working on me and undoing everything that was in me, I did feel like they can't have invested that much in creating a sense of affiliation and identification and expect only compliance in that identification. That investment means that we have a passionate investment which doesn't only work the way you want it to work, And so I called that piece Diasporic Politics Boomerang, because I realized that all those shlichim that they sent year after year after year were there for a purpose. It wasn't just because, oh, how interesting, but that there was a machinery to produce a kind of affectively devoted diasporic clientele for that state. And I hadn't obviously seen it that way before. And I began to appreciate how much a product of it I was. And I felt a sense of obligation to perform the citizenship in a way that had been bestowed on me by that machinery.